I didn't hire him because I liked his smile. I hired him because he was the cheapest quote in the city, and I needed my grandmother's apartment fixed before the bank took it back. What I didn't know was that the man swinging a hammer through my hallway had grown up in these rooms, and that by the time the walls were finally repaired, so would I be. But what happened next changed my life forever. The apartment smelled like dust and old paper the day I opened the door for the first time in 6 years. My grandmother had died in the spring, and the lawyer's letter had taken 3 months to find me, because I'd spent the last decade making sure nobody could find me easily. I stood in the doorway of her third-floor walk-up on Larkspur Street, keys cold in my palm, and felt the particular grief of inheriting a place I barely remembered. The apartment was falling apart. Water stains bloomed across the ceiling like continents on an old map. The kitchen cabinets hung from single hinges. A whole section of the hallway wall had buckled from a leak nobody had fixed in years. I am an architect. I spend my days designing other people's dream homes, clean lines and glass and light. I did not have the money, the time, or honestly the emotional bandwidth to fix my own inheritance. But the bank had made it clear: repair the place and sell it, or lose it to code violations and back taxes. So I called 4 contractors. 3 never called back. The 4th answered on the second ring, in a voice that sounded like he was laughing at something before I'd even said hello. "Cruise restoration," he said. "Talk to me." I explained the situation: old building, water damage, a deadline that made my stomach hurt. He asked for the address. There was a pause on the line, longer than it should have been. "Larkspur Street," he said again, quieter. "You said Larkspur?" "That's right." "Why, do you know the building?" Another pause. "I know the block," he said, and something in his tone made me think that wasn't the whole truth. "I can come by tomorrow morning." 9 work for you? It did. I told myself the strange pause meant nothing. I had a lot of practice telling myself things meant nothing. He showed up at 8:57, 3 minutes early, in a pink-flecked jacket with the sleeves pushed up his forearms. He was tall, dark-haired, maybe a few years older than me, with the kind of face that looked like it had learned to be careful about showing what it felt. His eyes went past me into the apartment before he even said good morning, scanning the hallway, the ceiling, the crown molding, the way a person looks at something they're afraid might have changed. "Elias," I said, holding out my hand. "Gabriel." His grip was firm, his palm rough with old calluses. He didn't let go right away. "This is a beautiful building," he said, looking past my shoulder again. "Pre-war. They don't build stairwells like that anymore. You'd know better than me. I've spent about 4 hours total in this apartment in the last 20 years. Something crossed his face, surprise, maybe, or relief, gone before I could name it. "Then let's see what we're working with," he said, and stepped past me into a hallway like he already knew exactly where the bad boards were. He did know. He stepped over a warped floorboard without looking down. He reached for a light switch that didn't work, like his hand remembered it from somewhere his mind hadn't caught up to yet. I noticed. I filed it away. I did not ask. By the end of that first hour, I had a quote, a start date, and an uncomfortable, unfamiliar flutter of curiosity about a man I had just met. Gabriel started work on a Monday, and by Wednesday I had rearranged my entire schedule to work from the apartment instead of my office, which I told myself was purely about supervising the renovation. He worked with a kind of quiet reverence I hadn't expected from a contractor. He didn't just rip out the damaged plaster, he ran his palm along it first, like he was saying goodbye to something. When he pulled up the buckled hallway floorboards, he set aside 3 of them instead of tossing them in the dumpster. "Sentimental about wood?" I asked, leaning in the doorway with 2 coffees, because I had started bringing 2 coffees. "Some of it's good oak. Worth keeping." He didn't look up from the boards. "Some things are worth keeping even when they're damaged." It was such a strange, specific thing to say about flooring that I almost asked him to explain. Instead, I handed him a coffee, and he thanked me with a smile that made the whole ruined hallway feel less like a symbol of everything I'd been avoiding. We fell into a rhythm. I worked at the kitchen table, answering emails about other people's houses, while he worked through the apartment room by room. Around noon he'd take a break, and somehow those breaks kept getting longer. He told me about growing up around here, vague on details, specific on feeling, the way the afternoon light came through stairwell windows in October, the sound the radiators made in winter, like the building was clearing its throat. "You talk about this building like you've lived in it," I said one afternoon, only half joking. "I've worked on a lot of old places," he said, which wasn't an answer, and we both seemed to notice that it wasn't. I told him about my grandmother instead, safer ground. How she used to send me peppermints in the mail when I was in college, how I hadn't visited enough before she got sick, how guilt sat in my chest now like a second heartbeat. Gabriel listened the way almost nobody listens anymore, not waiting for his turn to talk, just present, his eyes steady on mine. "She sounds like she loved you a lot," he said. "She did. I wasn't always good at knowing what to do with that." "That's not the same as not deserving it," he said, so gently that I had to look away first. That night, after he left, I stood in the half-stripped hallway and realized I'd told a stranger more about my grandmother in 4 days than I'd told my last boyfriend in 4 years. I didn't know what to do with that either. By the second week, I'd learned the specific quiet that meant Gabriel was thinking about something he wasn't saying. It happened most in the back bedroom, the smallest room in the apartment, the one my grandmother had used for storage, stacked with boxes I hadn't opened. Gabriel had offered to clear it for the rewiring, and I'd found him standing in the doorway one morning, not moving, just looking at the wall where a strip of old wallpaper, yellow roses, badly faded, had come loose at the seam. "You okay?" I asked. He startled, which he never did. "Yeah. Sorry. Old houses do that. You start seeing ghosts in the details." He forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'll have this wall down by Thursday." I let it go, because I had my own ghosts and I understood the impulse to keep them behind closed doors. But that evening, staying later than I should have to help, I found him crouched by the baseboard with his phone flashlight, tracing something with his finger. When he heard me, he stood up fast, guilty, like I'd caught him somewhere he shouldn't be. "What is it?" "Nothing. Old pencil marks. Somebody used to measure a kid's height on this wall." He said it too fast, too flat. I crouched down to look. Faint lines, a column of them, climbing the baseboard, with tiny numbers beside them that had mostly worn away. Someone had marked a child growing up in this exact room. "Family that lived here before my grandmother, maybe," I said. Gabriel didn't answer. He was looking at the marks like they'd said his name. I should have asked him directly, right then, what he wasn't telling me. Instead, I asked something smaller, safer. "Do you have family nearby? You said you grew up around here." "Not anymore." His voice had gone somewhere else, somewhere cold. "It's a long story, and it's getting late. I should go." He left without his usual joke at the door, without the coffee cup he usually forgot on purpose so he'd have a reason to come back for it in the morning. I stood in the stripped bare room a long time after, staring at a stranger's height marks on the wall, feeling like I'd almost touched something important and let it slip through my fingers. He came back the next morning like nothing had happened, which told me everything had. We didn't talk about the wall. We talked about paint colors instead, which felt like the safest possible subject, and somehow turned into an hour-long argument about whether the living room should be warm white or actual white, which turned into him laughing so hard at my paint chip indecision that he had to sit down on an upturned bucket to recover. It was easy to forget, in moments like that I'd promised myself I wasn't going to do this again, wasn't going to let someone matter, wasn't going to open a door I couldn't close if it went wrong. 3 years ago I'd loved someone enough to plan a life around him, and he'd left on a Tuesday with 2 suitcases and an apology that didn't explain anything. Since then I'd kept things light, manageable, contained. Gabriel was none of those things, and I was starting to notice it in ways that scared me, the specific quiet in a room after he left, the way I found myself timing my coffee breaks to his, the fact that I'd started actually looking forward to Mondays. "Can I ask you something?" I said one evening, the two of us sitting on the floor of the half-painted living room because all the furniture had been pushed to one side. Depends on the question. Why did you take this job? A contractor who talks about crown molding like poetry doesn't usually take small residential patch jobs. You could be doing museums. Historic buildings. He was quiet long enough that I thought he wouldn't answer. Then, sometimes you take a job because you need the work. And sometimes you take it because you need something else, and you tell yourself it's about the work. Which one is this? He looked at me, really looked, the kind of look that felt like it was asking a question of its own. I'm still figuring that out, he said. I wanted to ask him to figure it out faster. Instead, I handed him the last slice of the pizza we'd ordered, and let the moment pass, the way I'd been letting moments pass with him for 2 weeks, each one a small, terrified act of almost. The kiss almost happened on a Thursday, and it was the latter's fault. I was holding it steady while Gabriel worked on the crown molding near the ceiling, and when he came down the last 2 rungs he misjudged the distance, and I caught him, arms around his waist, his hands landing on my shoulders, his face suddenly 6 inches from mine, both of us breathing harder than the moment required. Neither of us moved for 3 full seconds. His eyes dropped to my mouth. Mine did the same to his. The air between us went thick and electric, and I could feel his heartbeat where my hand had landed against his ribs. Then his phone rang. He stepped back like the latter had shocked him, answered it too quickly, and walked into the kitchen to take the call. When he came back, his face had changed, pale, tight, unreadable. Everything okay? I asked. Fine. Just a supplier thing. It wasn't fine. I knew it wasn't fine the way you know a lie by its shape rather than its content. I should head out early today. He left before 6, without the joke at the door, without meeting my eyes. I stood in my half-renovated living room, my shoulders still warm where his hands had been, and felt something close to panic, not because I'd almost kissed him, but because I very much hadn't wanted to stop. That night I did something I'd told myself I wouldn't do. I searched his name. Gabriel Cruz, contractor, didn't turn up much, a small business page, a few reviews. But 3 pages deep, I found an old university archive, a design award, 5 years back, under a name that matched his but a different, sharper title. Architectural Design Award category, Adaptive Reuse. Gabriel Cruz. A photo of a much younger Gabriel in a blazer, standing beside a rendering of a restored brownstone, smiling like the whole future belonged to him. I sat with that a long time. A man with a design award, an architecture degree implied by every line of that old page, was currently patching my drywall for hourly pay. Something had happened between that photo and this apartment. Something had made him disappear from one life and reappear, careful and quiet, in mine. I didn't confront him. I wasn't ready to admit how much I'd already looked, or how much it mattered. I found out the truth by accident, the way most truths arrive. He'd left his site folder on the kitchen table, measurements, permit copies, invoices, and when I moved it to make room for my laptop, an old photograph slipped out from between 2 pages. It had been folded so many times the creases had gone soft and white. It showed this apartment. My grandmother's living room, but years earlier, painted a warm yellow, sunlight pouring through the window I was currently sitting beside. A woman stood in the frame with her arm around a teenage boy, both of them laughing at something outside the shot. The boy had Gabriel's eyes. I was still holding the photo when he came back in from the hardware store. He saw my face before I said a word, and something in him seemed to collapse quietly, like a wall finally giving up the fight against water damage. "This was your home," I said. Not a question. He sat down across from me, slow, like his legs had made the decision before he had. "I grew up in this apartment," he said. "Ages 6 to 17. That's my mother in the photo. This was my room." He nodded toward the small back bedroom. "Those height marks on the baseboard, those are mine." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because the day I turned 18, my father found out I was gay, and he told me I could either change or leave. I left. I never came back, not even after he died, not even when this apartment changed hands twice." His voice had gone rough at the edges. When your call came through and I heard the address, I almost hung up. I told myself I'd just come see it once. Just look at it. I didn't expect, he stopped. Didn't expect what? I didn't expect there to be a reason to keep coming back that had nothing to do with the walls, he said, and finally looked at me. I understood, in that moment, why he'd flinched at the wallpaper, why he'd saved the floorboards, why his hands knew the light switches before his mind caught up. He hadn't taken this job for the money. He'd taken it because some part of him needed to touch his own history again, and he hadn't planned on falling for the person who now owned it. I should have told you the first day, he said. I'm sorry. Why didn't you? Because the moment I told you, it would become real. And I've spent 12 years making sure nothing about that house, this house, could hurt me again. He looked down at his hands. You started to matter before I was ready for anything to matter. That scared me more than the wallpaper did. We didn't talk for 3 days after that. It wasn't a fight, exactly. He still came to work, the deadline didn't care about our feelings. But something careful and formal had replaced the ease between us. He said good morning. He asked about paint samples. He didn't linger over coffee anymore. I told myself I understood his silence, because I had built an entire life around a similar silence. When my ex left, I hadn't screamed or begged. I had simply gone quiet, the way you go quiet around an old injury, protecting it by not naming it. Watching Gabriel do the same thing to me felt like watching my own reflection. On the third night, I found him in the small back bedroom after the other workers had gone, standing at the wall with the height marks, one hand pressed flat against the faded pencil lines. I used to hate this room, he said, without turning around. My father used to stand right where you're standing and tell me everything I was doing wrong with my life. I couldn't wait to leave it. He traced one of the higher marks, the last one, the one closest to the ceiling. This is the last one he ever measured. 2 months before I told him the truth about myself. And after? He never measured me again. Like once I said it out loud, I stopped being someone whose growth mattered to him. He finally turned to face me. I came back to this apartment thinking I could fix the walls and leave with the ghost quiet again. I didn't plan on you making noise in every room I walked into. I didn't do it on purpose. I know. That's the problem. He almost laughed, but it came out closer to breaking. I don't know how to let someone matter without being terrified they'll leave the second they know the whole truth about me. I know exactly what that feels like, I said. I've been doing the same thing to you since the day we met. Keeping things light so nothing could really hurt if it ended. He looked at me for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes. So what do we do with that? I don't know, I admitted. But I'd rather find out with you than keep being careful by myself. We agreed, without really agreeing out loud, to try. It wasn't dramatic. There was no grand kiss in the rain, no music swelling. There was just Gabriel staying later than the job required, and me stopping pretending I had emails to answer, and the two of us sitting on the floor of the half-finished living room with the last of the paint fumes in the air, talking about nothing important in a way that felt like everything. He told me about the years after he left, sleeping on a friend's couch, working construction because it was steady and paid cash, quietly finishing his degree at night while telling almost no one, because architecture had been his father's ambition for him before it became something to prove his father wrong about. Somewhere along the way, winning that award had felt less like triumph and more like a door back to a family that had already shut him out, so he'd stopped chasing the big firms and started restoring old buildings instead, quietly repairing things that reminded him of home, without the risk of loving something that could reject him back. That's what this apartment is to you, I said. A safe way to love something you're scared of. Yeah. His mouth curved rueful. And then you opened the door on the first day, and you weren't safe at all. You were a whole complicated person I couldn't control the outcome of. Is that a compliment? It's terrifying, he said. Which, apparently, is the same thing, with you. I told him things too, about my ex, about the particular shame of being left without an explanation, about how I'd built a career designing other people's homes because it let me care about walls and roofs instead of the people who might leave them. About my grandmother's peppermints, and how I hadn't visited enough, and how some nights I was more afraid of being the kind of person people leave than of anything else in the world. Somewhere in that conversation, without either of us announcing it, his hand found mine on the paint-splattered floor. Neither of us pulled away. His father's second call came on a Tuesday, not to Gabriel, but to me, because the number on the old work order for the building was still listed under a name the man recognized. Gabriel wasn't there when it happened. I answered thinking it was the flooring supplier, and instead heard an older, graveled voice ask if this was still the crew's residence, if his son was the one doing the renovation, if I would tell him his father was in the hospital and wanted to see him. I didn't know what to do with that kind of inheritance, someone else's decade of hurt, handed to me over the phone. When Gabriel arrived that afternoon, I told him plainly, because he deserved plainly, not softened. He went white. Then he went somewhere I couldn't follow, quiet in a way I hadn't seen since the day I found the photograph. "I'm not going," he said finally. "You don't have to decide right now. I already decided 12 years ago." He made his choice. I'm allowed to keep mine. His voice shook on the last word, which told me the decision wasn't as settled as he wanted it to sound. I didn't push. I just stayed, the way he had stayed with me through every quiet thing I hadn't wanted to say out loud. 2 days later, unprompted, he told me he was going to the hospital, not because his father deserved it, he said, but because he was tired of building his whole life around a wall that had already fallen down years ago. "Will you come with me?" he asked, and it cost him something to ask it. "Yes," I said. "Every time, if you want me to." His father was smaller than I expected, the way people are always smaller than the shape they've taken up in someone else's fear. I stood by the door while Gabriel approached the bed, and I watched 12 years of careful distance try to hold itself together in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and old regret. His father looked at him a long time before speaking. "You look like your mother," the old man said, which wasn't an apology, but wasn't nothing either. "I know," Gabriel said. "I measured you on that wall until you were 17. His father's voice cracked. I stopped because I didn't know how to keep measuring a son I didn't understand. That was my failure. Not yours. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation. There were no tears shed in slow motion, no music, no instant forgiveness. Gabriel didn't say "I forgive you," because he wasn't ready to, and I loved him a little more for not pretending otherwise. But he sat down in the chair beside the bed, and he stayed for an hour, and when we left he cried in the hospital parking lot in a way that seemed less like grief and more like a wall finally, safely, coming down on his own terms. "I don't know what this means yet," he said, wiping his face, embarrassed and unguarded at once. "It doesn't have to mean anything yet," I said. "It just has to be true." The apartment was finished on a Sunday in late October, exactly the kind of golden afternoon Gabriel had once described to me before I understood why he remembered the light so precisely. The hallway floor gleamed, patched with the old oak boards he'd saved instead of thrown away. The living room walls were actual white, because I'd finally admitted he was right. The back bedroom, his old room, had a fresh coat of pale yellow, the same color as the photograph, and in one corner, at his quiet request, we'd left a small section of the original baseboard exposed, the faded pencil marks of a boy growing up still visible beneath a thin layer of protective varnish. "So it's not forgotten," he'd said. "Just repaired around." We stood in the doorway together, looking at the finished room, my grandmother's apartment restored into something that was no longer only her memory or only his childhood, but something new that belonged, unmistakably, to both of us. "I have to ask you something," I said, and he turned, half smiling, already bracing for a joke that didn't come. "I was going to sell this place. That was the plan from day one, fix it, sell it, move on. I remember. I don't want to sell it anymore." He went very still. "Elias, I want to live in it. And I don't want to live in it alone." I took a breath, the kind I'd been avoiding for years, the kind that meant meaning something and risking losing it. "I know what it costs you to let someone matter. I know what it costs me too. I'm asking you to let it cost both of us together, instead of separately." Gabriel didn't answer with words at first. He crossed the small distance between us, the same distance that had almost closed on a ladder months earlier, and this time nothing interrupted it. When he finally kissed me, it was unhurried and certain, the kind of kiss that isn't the beginning of a story but the quiet, earned middle of one that's already been building for months. "I came here to fix a wall," he said against my forehead, laughing a little, wet-eyed. "I didn't expect to find my way back to a home. Or to fall in love doing it." "Neither did I said. "But I'm glad the wall needed fixing." Outside, the October light came through the window exactly the way he'd once described it, warm, low, gold, falling across the floorboards he'd refused to throw away, and the room he'd once wanted to forget, and the man he no longer had to be careful with. Some walls, it turns out, aren't meant to keep people out. They're meant to be knocked down by exactly the right person, at exactly the right time, so that something better can be built in their place.